Good morning. Good morning. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the National Homelessness Conference. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, my name's Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, AHURI, and a Non-Executive Director of Homelessness Australia. Welcome to those of you here with us in person in Canberra and to those of you joining us virtually online. I won't keep you too long this morning as we have a terrific program and I know you really want to get into it. I would like to again thank our key sponsors for this year's event, the ACT Government through the Community Services Directorate as our host partner, and the New South Wales Government through the Department of Communities and Justice as our platinum partner. Mission Australia sponsors of the very important bursary program which brings attendance of people with lived experience from across Australia, and Community Housing Limited, who sponsored last night's terrific welcome reception, which was a fantastic event for those who were there. Thanks to our many other sponsors and exhibitors supporting the National Homelessness Conference. Okay, some quick notes about the program today. We begin with a plenary session before breaking into concurrent sessions, and as we have exclusive use of the entire venue and plenty of digital directional signage, it should be fairly easy to find your way around. But if you have any trouble, please flag down one of the AHURI staff members in the black polos with branding, or the volunteers in the cyan t-shirts. They can help you find your way. You can also get assistance with directions or with anything else from the information desk in the middle of the foyer. Remember to use the conference app to participate in sessions by submitting questions. The instructions to download, I think, are about to appear on screen. And don't forget to use the app also to rate sessions at the end of them to give us that feedback on what's working and what we can improve on. The major concurrents and 3 of each set of standard concurrents are being live streamed and recorded, so you'll be able to watch them later if you miss them or there's some content you want to get back to later on. And today we open our exhibition precinct just across the foyer, which will be the location for the morning tea, the lunch and afternoon tea breaks, and all of the networking that goes with that. Please do take the time to visit our exhibitions, as I'm sure you'll find some information there useful to you. For those of you playing at home, you won't have to miss out. We also have a virtual exhibition where you can view a range of interesting material from each of the exhibitors' virtual stands. It's actually a pretty cool feature and I'd really encourage you to check it out. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm now delighted to welcome to the stage our lineup for the opening plenary session of day 2 entitled Ending Homelessness for Indigenous Australians. Please welcome our facilitator, Greg Slabb from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, and our panel members, Sandra Harben from the Aboriginal owned and operated community housing organisation in Perth, Noongar, Shane Hamilton from Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales, and Jenny Sams, consultant to Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Please make them all welcome.
Thanks, Michael. It's a little bit cool here in Canberra, as it always is, but if you've got a nice sunny day, it makes it sort of worthwhile. My name's Greg Slabb, and I'm from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, or NATSIHA, and I'm just delighted to welcome those of you who are here today live in Canberra, and also to those who are joining us virtually. And this is the opening session of day 2 of the National Homelessness Conference. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, and I'd also like to pay our respects to their elders and their communities, and for being on their land, and also respect their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. And we'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event, both in person and virtually. This session is being streamed and recorded and will be available for all delegates to view after the conference. Today we'll be asking questions both online and from in the room. For those of you who are joining us online, please use the Q&A tab to the right of your screen, and you can also use the discussion forum to chat with other delegates. You will also find a copy of today's presentations in the handout section, again on the right-hand side of the screen. For those in the room, if you wish to ask a question, please keep your questions to the point to enable us to get through as many as possible. sometimes we might have to just tell people to shorten it a little bit so that we keep on track, and it allows more of an opportunity for other people to put their questions forward. Alternatively, you can also use the Delegate app anytime during the presentation to ask a question. And when we get to the Q&A section of today's session, please raise your hand and wait for one of the volunteers. They're the people in the blue shirts, and they will bring a microphone to you. The biographies of all the presenters can be found in the Delegate app if you'd like to read more about them. I'm the Secretary of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, or NATSIHA, and we've been around for a few years, but I'll give you the story now. Okay, in July 2017, National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, who were around at the time, but unfortunately they're no longer with us, they held a workshop in Adelaide with the aim of establishing a national Indigenous housing peak body. The Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander housing representatives present unanimously voted in favour of a national peak housing association. Interim jurisdictional representatives were elected, and that was the birth of NATSIHA. However, it had been bubbling along for many, many years, and our sector, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community housing sector, saw a need for it, but it was just never came into fruition. And I think even back to the days of NATSIHA, NATSIHA were keen to develop a national peak, but like I say, it just never eventuated. So October 2017, representatives attend a NATSIHA workshop to map the way forward and to identify key issues across each jurisdiction. And for those of us in the housing sector, there are a lot of core issues, but then you've got the jurisdictional idiosyncrasies to go with that as well. So August 2018, representatives attend a workshop to develop the NATSIHA submission on closing the gap refresh, housing as a new target. It was unfortunate that housing wasn't included in the original closing the gap targets, and NATSIHA obviously put in a submission, as well as a lot of other Aboriginal organisations and non-Aboriginal organisations as well in the housing sector. Everybody saw the need for housing to be there, and as we know, a lot of the other social determinants are affected by housing. Obviously we're in a homelessness conference, then you've got health, the impact it has on your health, and then it's also the education. If you're not overcrowded, the children can more likely have a space to do their homework. All those sorts of things flow on from there. So, and then NATSIHA continued its focus regarding the Constitution, its Constitution and incorporation, and which occurred in December 2020. And then December last year, we were ACNC, or Community Benefit Registered as well. There's just some objectives and targets. A representative and collective voice and forum for Aboriginal land and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled housing sector. To collectively advocate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing needs, national leadership, collectively develop a national housing and homelessness strategy, which we'll be starting work on soon. Although that workshop we had a couple of years ago, that was the start of that journey, but now we're continuing to grow. We can have more input into it as well, which will be great. Improved housing outcomes. Address the social determinants of housing disadvantage, which I touched on a minute ago. Engage with and establish direct relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, community-controlled housing organisations. ATSICOs, some people know them as ICHOs, Indigenous housing organisations, or in New South Wales, Aboriginal community housing providers. We're trying to get ATSICOs adopted, but it's just one of those things. So we've got a consistent term across the whole of the country. Influence the broader housing system to provide high quality, accessible, affordable and culturally appropriate housing, and support organisations in gaining and maintaining registration. So we've got NERSH, we've got the Victorian model, and then also the West Australian model as well. And NATSIHA's already started to, had a few meetings with NERSH, the National Regulatory Scheme Community Housing, and also NIFIC as well, and the IBA. So we're starting to make steps and inroads into that, those sorts of, with those organisations. The jurisdictional peak bodies, Aboriginal Housing Victoria, the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association New South Wales, NATSIHA in Queensland, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Queensland, Aboriginal Housing Northern Territory. Now, we're just starting to work with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation, and we've got an embryonic set up in Western Australia with the Aboriginal Housing West Australia, or AWA, and so there's a lot of work to be done there. We're working closely with South Australia Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations Networks, and here in the ACT, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Elected Board. Now, the Closing the Gap, National Agreement on Closing the Gap, many of you are aware of it, probably at differing levels, and working in that space for the last 12 months or a couple of years really, you get a really good understanding of it. But I encourage you, if you haven't much information on it or experience with it, if you can go in and just Auntie Google, she'll show you where to go, or and then you can read it and then see what the how it works and what the national agreement is trying to achieve or aims to achieve. Enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and governments to work together. A genuine partnership between the Coalition of Peaks. Coalition of Peaks is made up of over 70 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations across Australia, including Peaks, and then also jurisdictional members. And the expertise of the Coalition of Peaks. Our organisations have had a lot of experience, and a lot of these organisations have been around for many years, and they started from scratch because there was a need, because our people weren't being had access to services, including housing and health and all those sorts of areas, back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and so these organisations were developed from there, for that need. And they've been central to the commitments of the National Agreement. The priority for reforms, I'll just touch on these. The priority for reform 1 is formal partnerships and shared decision making. Priority reform 2, building the community control sector, transforming government organisations, which is going to be a very interesting task, but I'm sure that we can make some real inroads there, working closely and in strong partnerships with them. This is another area that's critical, shared access to data and information at a regional level. Data makes the world go around, as you know, and Huri, as you're all aware, do a lot of work in that space, and there's other organisations as well, and that's also very, very useful, the AIHW and naturally the ABS as well. This is one of the key areas in regards to the, this is from the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. Outcome 9, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people secure appropriate, affordable housing that is aligned with their priorities and needs. And Target 9, it's a flow on from that. By 2031, increase the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in appropriately sized housing, not overcrowded, by 88%. I saw some work that's being done lately, or recently, in regards to homelessness and definitions, and what is homelessness from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context, because it does mean something different. A lot of people don't think they're homeless, so those homeless stats are probably going to be worse, and then so hopefully we can address those, or we can get some solid stats so that we can work off those collectively in the future. Some of the work that I was working on for the last over 6 months is the Housing Sector Strengthening Plan. The Housing Sector Strengthening Plan is in line with the strong community control sector elements. Now, the other sector strengthening plans as well, there's another 3 or 4. They are the key targets: workforce, capital infrastructure, service provision, governance, consistent funding model, which is always very, very hard, and it really cripples our Aboriginal and community and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled housing organisations, and then the peak body. The key takeaways, we've got the national challenges, workforce. These are in the Housing Sector Strengthening Plan. So the workforce, you've got objectives, measures of success, and it relates to the KPIs. Key areas for action. There's 14 key actions that have been identified, but we've also got a list of future actions which we didn't want to discard. We as in NATSIHA and the sector that we consulted with across Australia, so that they weren't off the radar, but they weren't in the key actions. So the Housing Sector Strengthening Plan journey and current status is the Housing Sector Strengthening Plan working group was set up, and the Housing Sector Strengthening Plan got to a strong draft, agreed draft across the jurisdictional representatives made up of government and community-controlled organisations in the housing sector. That draft went to the Partnership Working Group. It was in principle agreement for there. Then went to the Joint Council, which was coming up very soon, so that we're hoping that it'll get in principle agreement, and then we move forward to the policy partnership. So what's that space? The policy partnership's new. It's still being finalised and developed. So if you want to keep on top of things, that will give you a great insight into what's happening. And I'd just like to thank everybody for coming here today, and also for the opportunity to just give you a little bit of a snapshot of where NATSIHA is at and what we're targeting and will be doing in the future. So what I'd like to do now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and the first speaker is Shane Hamilton. And Shane, you've got Shane's bio there, and then Shane can provide a little bit of information about himself as well. Thank you.
That's good. Ooh. Sorry, I need these days. Even font 14 is still blurry. So, morning everybody. Look, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people and extend those respects to their elders past and present. And I acknowledge their ongoing connection and care for country. I want to talk a bit about history and policy context from a housing or an Indigenous housing perspective. I think that's important for a number of reasons, because one of them is that those historical policies still affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. And Greg just outlined, closing the gap initiatives that we've got, and that's starting to work towards addressing some of those. But I think it's important to understand where we've come from and part of the reasons why those gaps still exist today. In 2018, I co-authored a piece of work with Kerry Arabina and Chris Holland, and it was about reimagining Indigenous housing and looking at it from a health and wealth perspective, where housing as it was historically, which is again the reason why I want to talk about the historical context, housing was for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people prior to colonisation. So Australia finally seems to be coming to terms with its past, present and future. For some, it's a time to celebrate and look forward. For others, it's been an opportunity to reflect on a fraught history that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at least includes displacement, forced assimilation and widespread destruction of languages and culture. These experiences have perpetuated multi-generational impoverishment, and I'd like to take a historical policy context to begin our panel discussion today. So property inheritance was and remains a primary channel of intergenerational wealth accumulation in Australia. Between 2002 and 2012, approximately 1.8 million Australians inherited property and/or money, which has directly led to this cohort having greater access to the housing market. Further, an estimated 3.5 trillion worth of wealth will be transferred from baby boomers to younger Australians in the next 20 years. And this will be the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in Australian history. But this enormous accumulation of wealth was at the expense of about 500 Indigenous nations and their rights and interest in country, as indicated by millennial periods of occupation, spiritual connections to country, and customary usage rights and interests. Borders maintained by a system of international relations were markers of these nations' territorial sovereignty across the pre-contact Australian continent and surrounding islands, the original Indigenous estate. English law governing colonisation intended that a territory's inhabitants' customary land and water usage rights and interests would survive the radical Crown claim of sovereignty. Only if native title subsequently ceased to be exercised by its holders, or the Crown dealt with their land in incompatible ways, could it be extinguished, and only to the degree of incompatibility. To date, not one treaty has formalised a single Indigenous nation's sovereignty transfer or terms of non-Indigenous accommodation. Instead, through the terra nullius fiction, the 500 nations' territorial sovereignty was simply vested in the Crown upon claim, bringing it within an English property law framework as Crown land. With sovereignty unrecognised, native title property rights legally evaporated, and the oldest continuous cultures in human history were effectively rendered homeless. This was compounded by the colonising settlers erasing almost all traces and memory of Indigenous permanent housing and settlements. And for the next 200 years, Crown grant of the cheap sale of a seemingly inexhaustible supply of freehold titles and lease options in the most economically valuable parts of the Indigenous estate drove the mass migration of millions of Anglo-Celtic poor and middle-class populations to Australia, and thereby effectively cementing the Crown's claim. There are three ways to understand how colonisation is still working within significant parts of Indigenous Australia as a negative ecology. In other words, how its momentum is yet to exhaust itself or otherwise be proactively reversed by a national embrace of decolonisation practice. The first connection is contemporary socio-economic circumstances. Both relative Indigenous population disadvantage and non-Indigenous population advantage begins with colonisation. The association between the two is direct. The colonising population's gain of the original Indigenous estate and economic basis thereon was at Indigenous cost. Population-level homelessness by dispossession was followed by segregation under protection laws designed to keep dispossessed Indigenous populations away from the colonisers. And these laws, supported by racist social norms, restricted where Indigenous people could live and the hours they could be in certain areas. Subject to criminal sanction, dedicated church mission and Crown land reserves became places of both confinement and refuge, but living conditions were usually dire. This was the experience of tens of thousands of Indigenous people from varying countries and with varying languages and cultures. Particularly affected were those from the most economically productive parts of the Indigenous estate. While Australia's colonisers were accumulating today's $10 trillion of population wealth, segregation kept the forebears of contemporary Indigenous Australians apart not only from their traditional economic bases, but also the rapidly growing colonial state economies. This meant they had limited access to education, employment, and wealth generating opportunities, as well as medical and environmental health advances. The legacies of dispossession and segregation are the socio-economic gaps that mark today's Indigenous disadvantage, the gaps that the nation to date has proven unable to close. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have always invented ways to flourish, from the time they lived in villages that were replenished with complex water management systems, sophisticated housing, stone quarries and seed grinding and storage arrangements. Not only were these villages functional, but they were places of solace and comfort, fundamental to food production and cultural cultural economies and mark the movement towards agricultural resilience. Housing, health and wealth have been the mainstay of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' construction, ingenuity and food production. Such a legacy is often erased in the impoverished national debate about access to social or community housing that lacks the aesthetic proportions, tasteful positioning and social harmony which previously featured in our eco-precincts across the country. Those responsible for implementing quality housing outcomes for families and communities are often invisible to outsiders. And yet, as is known in these communities, housing is central to creating opportunities for improving participation in land, kinship and cultural activities, and facilitating language, spiritual connectedness and engagement with country. Housing has always been and will remain an important determinant that provides the space and place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to experience connection, love and appreciation for the cultural ways of achieving well-being. Housing has provided the foundations for living on this continent for millennia and will be important in guiding 21st century living so we can all thrive, flourish and prosper. Re-engaging with housing, health and wealth creation is essential for the acquisition of skills, ecological sustainability and building technologies that are likely to greatly impact the future of well-being, not only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for all Australians. I now want to talk a bit about funding, just to round out Greg's point around closing the gap. The New South Wales Government $554 million housing package investment in 2022, which includes $300 million upgrade to 15,800 social homes, $149 million to deliver 200 and 260 upgraded homes for Aboriginal families and install 4,400 climate resilience and energy saving upgrades. $67 million to continue and expand the Strong Family, Strong Communities program, $37 million to deliver the Together Home Transition program in partnership with community housing providers, providing 120 new social homes for rough sleepers. The investment was in addition to the $401 million over 4 years announced by the government to prioritise closing the gap and improve outcomes for Aboriginal people across the state. That is they're a great start. We still have a long way to go. I think the most fundamental thing for Australia is that our housing situation is at crisis proportions that affects all Australians, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we are particularly affected by it. And I hope I've outlined that from a historical context. Thank you.
You just go straight up. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you, Shane. That was great. And Greg. My name's Jenny Sams. I previous salary job was CEO of Aboriginal Housing Victoria, and I continue working alongside Aboriginal Housing Victoria and the work we're doing across community on Aboriginal housing and homelessness. I also would like to acknowledge traditional owners and Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And I'd also like to thank you all for coming along to hear us. I just sit and I listen to Greg and the context and close the gap. Finally, we've got housing there, Shane's story of history and then investment and closing the gap. And, you know, housing and homelessness has always, I think, been the poor policy partner in social policy more general. And I've been a public servant for 35 years as well, so I sort of know my way around that. And it takes a massive crisis for us to get any attention. Now, we'll make the best of it, but it's pretty damning that you wait until things get this bad for everyone, not just Aboriginal people, but like everything, Aboriginal people are at the pointy end of the crisis. So what I want to do today is work through, and I hope I'm not too dry and boring, the way Victoria's tackling housing and homelessness for Aboriginal people. Tomorrow, Sean Middlebrook, my friend and colleague, and Dan Jefferson from KPMG will drill down more into the blueprint for homelessness service system reform in Victoria, which we think has great potential. I'd also like to just reflect, and I haven't got the good, powerful story you have, Shane, of the history, and couldn't do it the same justice, but Aboriginal homelessness always has to be put into the context of the history and the circumstances of, in our post-colonial world, the jurisdictions we live in. In Victoria, the decimation and destruction of homelands, of people, of language and culture was massively fast, particularly when you got out into the western and eastern parts of Victoria, you know, that could less well be controlled, not that anything was, from New South Wales, but also from what emerged as Melbourne. Part of what happened, in my view, is, and others' views, I guess, is following the genocide in Tasmania. People came to Victoria looking for rich pastoral lands, and they knew how to take them and take them very quickly. So that's what we're left with. Of those Aboriginal people who survived in the 1800s, there was most certainly quite constructive and productive attempts to work alongside the settler economy, but it's almost like every generation when that happened, it was eroded or it was stopped. So, you know, during the gold rushes, Aboriginal people were trading possum skin cloaks because everyone was freezing cold going to Ballarat, etc., etc. It was stopped. There was movement into agriculture. It was stopped. So it was almost the moment you popped your head up, it was chopped off. And I think that's what we're seeing in Victoria, this very early destruction playing itself out in homelessness that is both structural and spiritual. So, and I know Sandra's going to talk more about spiritual homelessness, and again, probably do it more justice than me, but you've got to remember that it is this structural, spiritual side of Aboriginal homelessness that means we've got to shape our responses differently. Some things are exactly the same, like I need a bloody roof over my head, but other things are a bit different. So if I can turn to, and I've put here a very tight summary of how we're tackling things in Victoria. Victoria, as you may have heard, is doing quite well on its path towards treaty and truth-telling. It's on the agenda. In terms of the public service, there's a clear understanding of Aboriginal self-determination, probably not always a clear understanding of what that means in all cases, but we're all forming up our understanding of self-determination. It's very different from how we thought about it 15 years ago as a community anyway, so, you know, that's understandable. So what we've done is put together a framework which looks like this, and you can get it from the website. And it's a framework around housing and homelessness. The community said very loudly, homelessness should not be a separate system from housing. We've got to think of them both together because at the end of the day, it's about every Aboriginal person having a home, and that's our vision, as you can see. The purpose of our framework is that is quality housing outcomes in a generation. So that's a long way to go, and I'm going to come to some depressing data just again for us. And our challenge, we did work on modelling numbers. Our challenge is with population growth, we're going to need 27,000 additional Aboriginal households, but housing for Aboriginal households by 2036, and of those about 5,000 will be social housing that's needed. So in terms of the principles, self-determination I've mentioned, and I'm only going to highlight 3 of them: housing first and cultural safety and access. All of the principles matter, but those 3 to me always stand out and the ones that we have to check everything we do against. The reason we've approached this task the way we have in terms of a framework is that's partly the way public policy's done in Victoria, so that's the way you sort of can work with government. But we also believe that if we want self-determination, we've got to step up and design the solutions. We're way past the years where we just sort of thump the table and say, do this, do that, and we want more. We do want more, and we don't want to let the government off the hook on social housing or any of those things. But we have to step up and lead with the solutions. But of course, we need to do it in partnership. So this framework has been designed by the community, work led by Aboriginal Housing Victoria, and also accepted, endorsed by the Victorian Government. And I have to pay tribute to Homes Victoria's CEO, Ben Rimmer, who's encouraged and respected us and walked alongside us, shown confidence. He's probably feeling a bit nervous at times. I would be if I was in his job, you know, hoping that we're going to deliver, but he's stuck his neck out and done that. So what we've got is a framework, and I will go to the next bit, hopefully. So, sorry, I'll go back. Never my thing. There we are. What's the challenge we're facing? And you can probably guess at it, but I'll just quickly go through the data. Population growth. Victoria now has the fourth highest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in the country. More people are identifying. People are coming to live in Victoria, probably not so much since COVID, but they were. And high reproduction rates. So the population's expected to reach 95,000 in 2036, which drives this demand for additional housing. 43% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Victorians own or are purchasing their own house. We think that's an overstatement from what we know of the community, but compared to 68% of the general population. So again, you don't have your own home, you don't have the intergenerational wealth, so the next generation doesn't pick up those advantages. 36% living in the private rental market, facing discrimination, unaffordability, the whole thing. 1 in 4 Aboriginal households live in social housing in Victoria. A similar number or ratio are on the Victorian Housing Register waiting for housing, so it's very, very high. The thing that shocked us, and I don't know why we weren't more aware of this earlier, is that 17% of Victoria's Aboriginal population sought assistance from homelessness services. That figure's been stuck up and down a little bit for quite some years now. If you translated that into a similar proportion for the general community, you'd be talking about 1 million Victorians seeking specialist homelessness services assistance. And as if anyone would stand for that, you know, to be considered the greatest crisis of all time, but somehow we just trundle along and that's okay. And of those who approached homelessness services, 44% were already homeless. And once you get to a homelessness service, your outcomes, if you're Aboriginal, are not much different from the general population, and that goes to the difficulty in securing any form of even crisis accommodation. But it says something about this constant circulation of people. So what were we going to do? And I go back to the importance of having a house. That's where we want to be. We don't want to be dependent on government anymore. I'm going to hope for the best. So what's our model for change? This is a bit of a busy diagram, I realise that, but it's actually very important. What we're talking about is progression to long-term sustainable housing. It's not linear, it's circular. You might hop off the track at some point and hop back on at another point, but it is about moving from homelessness to transitional housing transitional housing to social housing, and I realise you can go straight from homelessness to social housing or private or whatever, from social housing to secure private rental, from housing stress in private rental to affordable housing, from affordable rental housing to home ownership, and from narrow and rigid notions of traditional tenure to culturally fit tenures which combine Aboriginal community and individual home ownership. And that last point is really important. And I think I've sort of mentioned it, but I'll say it again. It is getting off dependence on government. Individual home ownership is as legitimate as community ownership of housing. It is independence and determining how you want your housing to look in your future. So that is a really important part of our thinking. And it was interesting when we started putting that to government in the early days. A very friendly Minister for Housing and Aboriginal Affairs at the time said, be very, very careful. You'll end up letting government off the hook. And we hope that doesn't happen. But it's important to say this is about independence and getting off this journey of always fronting up with your cap in hand, asking for more. We set goals, and here they are. And again, this goes to a way of organising your thinking and trying to move forward. And we have had a bit of success, we reckon. It's a long way off where we need to be, but we're getting progress. The first one's the importance of housing as a base for improved life outcomes, and Greg and Shane have mentioned that. I think one of the things we've seen, and a truly shocking incident I saw near me last week, is what happens when you just land homeless people into longer term housing without any support. I mean, some people can cope, but many can't. People need support. Sometimes they need support forever. Sometimes they need it for 6 months. Sometimes they need it for 2 weeks. But support to establish housing, and then using housing as a base for building your long-term aspirations for you and your family. So those services alongside the actual building are absolutely critical. Building supply to meet the needs of a growing population. So as I said, 2036, we're going to need 27,000 houses. We need 5,000 plus social housing properties to only keep pace with the current situation because of the population growth. In fact, we need to do better than that because the current situation is resulting in unmet demand. So at least 300 houses a year to be built. Meeting the supply need for transitional and crisis housing, and using native title and treaty to grow affordable housing. And again, there's a bit of movement and thinking happening there around the treaty agenda, and our Aboriginal Housing Summit next week, we'll be talking more about those opportunities. Opening doors to home ownership and private rental, and we've got a few things happening there, but that needs to happen, moving from marginal housing to ownership. An Aboriginal focused homelessness service system, and again, as I mentioned, that'll be discussed more tomorrow, and a capable system that delivers Aboriginal housing needs, which includes a culturally competent mainstream and a capable Aboriginal controlled sector. So they're our areas, and I'm going to just finish off with a snapshot on progress. I mean, it always pays to have logic and a bit of rigour around how you think about what you need, but it also makes it easier for government and other agencies to link into what needs to be done, and this is what we've found has happened. So the first thing we did was set up a governance structure. So there's a shared governance structure with Homes Victoria, part of the Victorian government, but Aboriginal Housing Victoria with the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum, all the ACOs that have housing provision and homelessness services are leading the implementation. Victoria's big housing build, 10% of the 8,200 big housing build houses will be going to Aboriginal social housing applicants, which is in line with the target we set around reducing Aboriginal homelessness by 10% a year. 150 million will be for 400 new houses to be built by Aboriginal organisations. That is a big task. Aboriginal Housing Victoria is the only registered community housing provider, Aboriginal community housing providers, but we're working through partnership and other arrangements for other ACCOs to be part of that big build. So I think that's one of our biggest steps forward, actually, because not only does it build houses, it builds capacity of ACCOs. We've had a building works package of 35 million that is currently being delivered by Aboriginal Housing Victoria in partnership with 18 ACCOs for maintenance, refurbishment and upgrades. And again, it's been a really difficult time to do that with constraints in the building industry, lockdowns and all the rest, but we're doing it. And as Esme Bamblett from the League said when, we're all getting a bit worked up because we can't quite get there, she said, let's face it, we're doing this for ourselves and it's working, and that's exactly what's happening. 4.2 million to establish an Aboriginal private rental assistance program. I'm pleased to say both Chia Vic and the Council to Homeless Persons initiated Aboriginal cultural safety frameworks for their sectors, and they are complete. The blueprint for improved homelessness services, shared equity to support home ownership, getting off to a very, very slow start, but it's there and happening and changing the thinking. We have a community summit next week, and we put out an annual report card, which is really, really important, and government takes it seriously because it holds us all to account. It holds government to account, but we've all got to be held to account around what we're doing. So that's where we're at, sort of working, sort of making progress. Got a long way to go, but we've got some good partnerships up. Thank you.
So, hello, my name's Sandra Harben. Normally, if I'm in my own budja, my own land, I say kaya, which is hello in the Noongar language. But first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people who's on land that we are meeting today. Pay my respects to your elders, past, present and emerging. So as I said, kaya is hello in the Noongar language, and I'm a Wajak Noongar from the southwest of Western Australia, and I'm very honoured to be here, and it's a privilege. And I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit about the Noongar Housing First Principles, which is about, I guess, reform, and that's why I've gone last. And I want to acknowledge Shane and Jenny. It was wonderful listening to Shane talk about, the historical context, because as I sat there listening, I thought how important that is to understand in terms of Aboriginal people and where we sit in society in health, housing, education and so on, and the impact that colonisation had on Aboriginal people. And I thought one of the really important things that Shane said was how with colonisation, dispossession of not only our land, but disconnection from our families, and also then being segregated from families, and then disconnection from culture. And so this is where, I'm really happy to be talking about the Noongar Housing First Principles, because I've been to a couple of conferences recently, and what I picked up was didn't matter what the Aboriginal presenters were talking about, culture was at the forefront of their programs and what they talked about. And so the Noongar Housing First Principles came out of the Australia's Housing First Principles. And our chairperson said, well, we're listening to people from international countries telling us about Housing First Principles. And what I want to do as the Noongar and chairperson of the Noongar Maya is we want to have a Noongar housing first principles. And I wasn't sure at first how that was going to happen, but I soon realised I was given this 6-month project that culture really was the foundation of this Noongar housing first principles. And so, as I said, Shane mentioned how all of this was taken away from Aboriginal people, and I'm really passionate about bringing culture back into service delivery. So whether it's health, housing, education, but culture needs to be the foundation of services by all service providers. And I'm sure you'll understand a little bit more when as I go on. A journey and a simple question. You know, we've got to start somewhere, and what can we do to make change? And so the Noongar people in Western Australia are really sort of coming together, and they're becoming movers and shakers in terms of where do Noongar people stand in society and in generally, and what is it that we want to achieve and do, and make sure that we are included in a collaborative way, not just as an afterthought. So the community are feeling no trust, faith in the system. So I think we all know what the system is, because they've given feedback, they've given the trust and the benefit of the doubt, and nothing has come forward, nothing's changed. We just keep doing what we've always done. And I think we can all understand what that means, and especially us Aboriginal people. We can understand that, well, what has changed? And as Jenny just said, well, you know, we're making progress, but it's small progress. And so the question for us is, what can we do to change? So address the systemic structural racism. So commit to decolonising our ways of being, knowing and doing. Start with an Aboriginal worldview. And in this instance, the Noongar Housing First Principles is start with a Noongar worldview. And I do want to say that the Noongar Housing First Principles can be applied across all Aboriginal language groups. It's just that those language groups, those leaders, those people working in the housing homeless space bring their cultural laws and values in and apply them into the Housing First Principles. And so when we don't start with an Aboriginal worldview, it's easy to have the wrong starting system. As Jenny said, I'm, spirit-led, and I'll talk about spirituality because as an Aboriginal person, as a Noongar person, you know, our Wirn, our spirit, it's our personal spirit. It what makes us strong and healthy, and it empowers us. And so all of the things that are important to all of us as human beings, so housing, health, education, our sense of identity, who we are, it's what makes our Wirn really strong, our spirit. And through the Noongar Housing First Principles, we believe that working from a Noongar laws, from a Noongar framework, that it can only mean that Noongar people are left with a very, very strong Wirn and a strong spirit. And so relationship building at the heart. So what is Noongar Mai doing to make change in the homelessness space? So I'm the Noongar cultural consultant. I was brought on to develop the Noongar Housing First Principles 18 months ago. I was only supposed to work in the space for 6 months, but here I am 18 months later and thoroughly enjoying it. And I'm developing programs and resources for anyone who is working with Noongar people and our clients, and with our ACOs and NGO partners. So why was the model, so why it was developed? So it's been developed to help Noongar, Maya and other housing providers to support and to create culturally safe environments. And we've heard the word culturally safe, culture, in the first two presentations. So for Noongar people experiencing homelessness, their families and communities. So the Housing First Principles Australia was used to guide the Noongar Housing First Principles. And the principles are grounded in our language, doinch, doinch, kuring, going along together, because we want to achieve greater collective impact through meaningful partnerships and strong relationships throughout the journey, and provide culturally safe housing. And so I guess the question is, what is culturally safe housing? And maybe that'll be a question and we can come to that later. So working with Noongar people requires an understanding of the importance of culture being embedded into all programs and service delivery. And we reiterate that for Housing First interventions to be successful, all service providers must establish culturally safe and secure practices to recognise and respect Noongar culture as a source of great strength to the Noongar people, and design and deliver services that meets the needs of the mob and the expectations and rights of individuals, families and communities. So what does the Noongar Housing First model look like? Well, there are 6 principles. Principle 1 is that Noongar people and their families have a right to a home with cultural connections to Budja, Murt and Kadajin. Your Budja is your land, and we heard Shane speak about the importance of being connected to land. Murt is your family, and Kadajin, that is our knowledge, that's our cultural knowledge. And that cultural knowledge isn't just, you know, about language and ceremony, but it's connecting us to our old people, to our people who hold the stories, the language. You know, it's our grapevine. Because if you disconnect the people from the land, then spiritually they're going to be wara or minditch, they're going to be sick. And that's what Aboriginal people say. You know, we've got to be connected to our land. And what we find is that a lot of our people are housed in different parts of country where we have no cultural and spiritual connection to it. You know, that's just a no-no. Principle 2 is support is flexible, culturally appropriate, and is available whenever needed. And so what we mean by that is, you know, families are supported holistically by their mort, their family. The cycle of support is never ending. And I heard Jenny say earlier that, you know, there was a family that was put into, a homeless family put into housing, and I guess they've been left to just survive. But what we're saying is, no, the cycle is never ending. Support is always there when the person or the family needs it and if they want it, and service providers should always be available to make sure that that they're there. Also with the principle 2 is that the holistic needs of Noongar people, so their physical, cultural and spiritual needs are supported, and support is directed by the people receiving the support. So there's a whole lot of information around the principles, which I'll show you with the link later on. Principle 3, choice and self-determination with no cultural compromise. Because what's happened since colonisation, Aboriginal people have been on the fringes. Aboriginal people are excluded from you know, living in towns, accessing health, education. most of us as Aboriginal people can tell a story. We have family that's, live that, and we've got relations that can tell us stories. And so, coming back to the Noongar Housing First principles, no, we're saying no cultural compromise, particularly when it comes to Budja, Mort and Kudjin. So your land being connected to your family, which then connects you by definition to your Kudjin, to your stories, to your language, to the children being taught who family is, how they're connected, because knowing who you belong to, knowing who your family is, knowing where your land is, gives us our cultural identity. And that's more important than, where we live and where we work. Our cultural identity for us is number one. Well, it certainly is for me. And so Noongar people define for themselves what makes a place a home, which may include connection to particular mort, particular family, particular land, or to particular families. And Noongar people are given a choice of where they live and the type of housing in which they live. Because what happens, we know that in mainstream housing, you take the house that's next on the list. Working in that sort of way has absolutely no meaning for Aboriginal people and for Noongar people. If for example, the house became available for you, it might be in a place called Wanneroo, which is, 30 minutes up out of the city. But all your mort, your mob and your connection to your family, etc., might be down in Rockingham, which is at the other end of the city. So you're at two totally different ends of the Budja. You might still be in Wajak Budja, but you've got no connection to your mort. And we're saying this has got to stop. We've got to look at, from a cultural perspective, where Noongar people are housed. They have a right to be housed near their family, which then means that we continue our connection to our knowledge. Because again, when you are taken away from your land, from your family, you're removed, then again, we are just continuing that historical way of working with Aboriginal people, is like put them up there, they've got a house, they should be satisfied. No, because all of these things come back to your spirituality, to your Wirin. And as Aboriginal people, we need a strong Wirin. We need to have a Murdich cart, we need to have a Murdich court, and we need to have a Murdich Wirin. So a strong head, a good heart, a strong heart, and a strong spirit. Because these are the things that will lift our people up and to give them pride in their cultural identity and to empower them and to help them through the journey that they need to be on. But from a healthy perspective, not from a vulnerable, weakened spirit where they see hopelessness. Principle 4 is about culturally appropriate active engagement, and we say that's through Quop Da. Well, we're saying is that, that's with good speak. Because we know that in the past, a lot of Aboriginal people have been, and they'll tell you, and you probably all heard, they say, don't like the way that person speaks to me. They talk down to us. They speak high language, and so what we're saying is, come and engage through Quop Da, through good speak, and also those things that include Kundan. Kundan is respect. So the onus is on workers to show respect for the people and for their culture. Kwapda, engage in good talk that is open and honest while individuals and families can refuse support. You know, the staff or the person engaging should persist without intruding and use their relationship to make ongoing and regular offers in ways that show care and respect for people and culture. So I guess in a sense what we're saying at Noongar Mai through the Noongar Housing First, if you don't know what the culture is, if you don't know who your local language group is, if you don't know what their laws are, what their values, then you probably quickly need to go out and get yourself informed or go and talk to the local Aboriginal people and engage with them and ask them, you know, what are your laws? So like for instance, you know, we say Kundan is respect, Kwapda is good speak. Kurt, a deep understanding of people means that support is designed to fit the individual and their murt, their kin, rather than the individual being required to fit the service. And we know that this is what happens. Kanya, workers employ creative and imaginative approaches to ensure their work is engaging rather than blaming people for disengaging. Our responsibility is to re-engage without blame or shame. And so Kanya is working with vulnerable people, and don't shame them. Don't make our mob feel shame. And Principle 5, support focuses on strengthening the Wirn. That is, to strengthen Wirn is to recover a sense of themselves and their place in their community. It strengthens the whole family and their connection to each other, their culture and their land. Hope. Support offers hope and actively encourages Noongar people to dream and imagine a future for themselves and allow them to make their own decisions that benefit them, their families and their culture, towards a future focusing on gaining a sense of purpose with the prospect of enjoying a good and secure life. And I guess that means like culturally appropriate, culturally safe, and a healthy, stable home environment and family creates strong Wirn, strong spirit for everyone. And Kanya, a process of trial and error involving small steps forward and backward, celebrating successful experiences but also learning from experiences of pain and frustration without Kanya, without a sense of shame. And Principle 6 is social, cultural, community inclusion. So that's Murt, Kadajan and Wirn. So what we've done within the Noongar Housing First Principles is weave all of the things that we've identified under each of the principles. So, for example, for the social, cultural and community inclusion, we've linked Murt, Kadajan and Wirn. So Murt is, you know, being with family, and Kadajan is knowledge, which is then your Wirn. So, and Noongar law finally is, oops, sorry, I think I need to go back. So, what we've done is the Noongar Housing First Principles have been based on Noongar law. So that could be Palawa law, it could be the Kuri law, but Noongar law has been practiced by Noongar people since the Nyiding, since the beginning of time, and law determines the cultural values of the Noongar nation and connects the people to their Buja, Murt and Kadajan, land, family and knowledge. And so what we want to do is bring back all of those things that were in place prior to colonisation, all of the things that Shane talked about, and we embed the Noongar Housing First Principles in all, across all of the different spaces, whether it be homelessness, housing, health and education. So, and just very quickly, I can see Greg, we're going to get to we'll go back, we'll get to the last one. I thought that I had put, anyway, if anyone wants to, I've actually got the slide that has all of the resources and where you can actually access the Noongar Housing First Principles. So thank you, Kaya Bruduan. I was trying to watch the time and everything.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Now we've got some, we're going to have more time for questions, but I think that the information that's been provided probably answered a lot of questions as well, because we went through each of the different areas, and it was great that Shane, Jenny and Sandra, they came at things from different angles, so it gave you a really good broad-based understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander homelessness, but and the history around that, and housing and all the other determinants as well. So so it was good, and as you know, in Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities, we like to do things in a holistic approach, so it was a good rounded off discussion and presentations. Now we've got some questions, so if people have got questions, if you can put your hand up, we've got the people there with the mics in the blue shirts, and so I'll kick off with one. It was more of a statement from Lisa Sampson in New South Wales. Why is it so easy for Western governments to accept intentional communities or international communities, co-ops and other forms of co-housing as alternatives, but not ours? Sandra, there's a question for you, Sandra. I really like the principles. Does Noongar Mai have a way of measuring or assessing adherence to your principles? If so, how does that work?
Well, we only just completed the Noongar Housing Principles in December last year. So, but what's been happening is that we do have a program where we have several Aboriginal caseworkers that work closely with the homeless, and we have been meeting, getting feedback and recording the information, how it's working, and we've had amazing stories of how the success of housing people, but implementing the Noongar housing principles is first and foremost in this program. So yes, we have got case studies, and we're continuing to monitoring the Noongar Housing First Principles. And from that, we're actually developing a service delivery model as well. So at the moment, we've got the Noongar Housing First Principles, we've got the cultural framework, and we're about to develop the service delivery model. So through the work that's being done with Noongar Housing First by the caseworkers.
Thank you. Jenny, is there evidence and research that shows the effectiveness or transitional or staircase models of housing for Aboriginal people? Why not housing first?
I don't know if I'm competent to answer that.
Okay, this is...
No, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be smart. I'm actually not sure that... I could very briefly talk about what we think about in terms of culturally fit tenures, and maybe, but whoever, please inform me better. From our point of view, and particularly living in a very urbanised community, around 50% of Victoria's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders live in Melbourne, the rest in regional areas, and more so in regional centres, but some smaller towns. The need varies. There's some very obvious things. Most people say to us they want to just live in a house that's a good, healthy house that doesn't stand out from everyone else, but I want to have my own garden, I want to have my own paintings and all the rest. And there's just some obvious things like flexibility, having parents in bedrooms near the kids, not in their own parents' master bedroom down the other end of the house, which doesn't go down well. Having big living areas that are flexible for when family comes along, not learning that the strengths of Aboriginal communities can sometimes be seen by people who don't understand the culture and the ways as reasons to actually evict people, and it seems ridiculous to me, but you know, you've got an overcrowded house because you've got a funeral, so you're in trouble. Well, in fact, that's the strength of your community, that you actually take people in. So I think there's things around that. We've got housing design principles, but I'm not sure I've probably answered the question in quite the way it was put. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, I just probably am not up to it.
All right, thanks, Jenny. Have we got any from the auditorium? I've got another one online. Yes, we've got a hand up over here.
Yeah, thanks for the information today. I have a question. I work in a service and just under 40% of our clients are First Nations people, yet I receive no funding from the government, and in all the services I've worked in over the last 15 years, I've never received any funding from government to buy in cultural services for my clients. And why is that so, and what can we do about that? Talk to you people.
Well, Noongar Maya certainly, you know, it's a non-for-profit organisation, and they don't get funding from government for that sort of thing. But for me to be brought on board as the Noongar cultural consultant to develop, you know, the cultural resources and the Noongar housing first principles came about with a collaboration with some funding through Shelter WA, and that was for 6 months. But I'm actually employed by Noongar Maya, and we certainly don't get any funding for my position. But because they're committed to the Noongar Housing First Principles and developing resources, from a Noongar perspective, they've kept me on. So sometimes, you know, if you really, really, really want it to happen, you can make it happen. But hopefully we'll be getting some funding soon to continue. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Different organisations need to put, you know, in their strategic plan or in their budgets, funding for cultural consultancies. Yeah, to bring culture into your space.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. It's a question, how can we address the barriers to self-determination within the context of social housing for First Nation people when the system is limited? Now, it's got allocation zones. I'm thinking that that's where, say, a housing organisation only has housing versus suburb-specific preferences. So I think Sandra touched on it earlier. You know, you've got housing in this end of the city, and then you've got housing this end. Shane?
Yeah, thanks for the questions, and the previous question around why government doesn't fund it. These questions have things about systems, and I have to say the fundamental problem we have is our system's completely broken. That's why when you talk about how do we, you know, adopt first principles and self-determination and talking about different areas, it's simply because we don't have enough housing for people who need it the most. That's the fundamental problem we have with our whole housing system. We have not had investment year on year for you know, so long that we're playing absolute catch up. And so all these points are relevant, but the reason is because we just simply don't have enough housing. I mean, that's the biggest issue our country has. We have, you know, some great funding that most governments have put in place now through Closing the Gap or different, you know, the build program in Victoria is great, and they will definitely help. But what we need is sustained funding year on year for at least the next decade and beyond, and have certainty about that. That's the problem we have here. And all of these things that we aspire to are things we should aspire to, but unless we have housing available for people, I mean, more than 50% of the people that live in private rental market in Australia now are in housing stress. The wait lists in public housing and social housing is massively climbing. And so we need a long-term sustainable investment in social and affordable housing across the country, you know, probably beyond the next decade.
No one else from internally? Okay. what are the panel, what are the suggestions for how non-Indigenous community organisations best work to support and collaborate with the housing goals of Aboriginal community controlled organisations?
I'm happy to have a go, but not the only one. I'll start. Can I just start off, and it's something I should have said and I didn't. Choice is really important, and there are many cases where Aboriginal people who are homeless and have been for some time and have other issues going alongside, particularly drug and alcohol issues, for whatever reason have to move away from their communities, and sometimes it doesn't work for them anymore going to an ACO, and their first choice is sometimes a mainstream organisation, and sometimes a mainstream organisation, and I can name a few which I won't publicly, do a very, very good job. And part of the key to having that work is that the mainstream has a relationship with an ACO somewhere in terms of cultural strength and safety and all of that understanding, but you can over time form a way between the mainstream and the ACO. So I just think that's an important component. Just in terms of, there's a lot that can be said in terms of supporting ACOs, and I think one of the real principles that people stumble on at times is really, at the end of the day, self-determination often means that if you're in the mainstream, you're going to give something up. And Australia as a community's got to confront that, and service providers have got to think that through. One of the things we're doing in Victoria with the Aboriginal Big Housing Build is I'm not doing it, sorry, the government is, but facilitating and supporting partnerships between registered Aboriginal housing organisations and ACOs to get funding through the Big Housing Build to build on generally ACO-owned land, but under the auspices of the Registered Housing Agency. And not only is the Registered Housing Agency lending its developmental experience, but also just beginning to support the ACOs on the pathway to community housing registration. So that's one example. It's early days. It requires enormous goodwill from the mainstream organisation, but as a couple have said to me, they're getting a lot out of it themselves in terms of opening their minds and learning new experiences.
Anybody else want to add to that? Or how do we adopt Aboriginal housing first principles when we have many different Aboriginal communities experiencing homelessness in our regions? I don't know where their regions are. Could be a city or wherever. I know, for example, Sydney's got two of the largest Aboriginal communities in Australia, in Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney. So what's the best way for them to adopt some principles?
Well, look, for me, I think it goes back to what I just mentioned before. I mean, housing first principles are great, but you've got to have housing available, and that, it's the biggest issue we have in the system. I'm sorry I keep banging on about it, but we can tinker around the edges, but we all know that everyone here works in this system and knows that supply of affordable housing for those people that can least afford it, we just simply don't have enough housing, and we haven't really seriously year on year. I mean, I don't know, and if Michael's still around, he will know this stuff, but the National Partnership Agreement that we have and the funding that each of the states and territories get, it'd be interesting to see what additional supply we did in the last financial year, notwithstanding some of the investment that's been made, but it's certainly in no way keeping up with demand.
Can we just go back to that question?
The previous.
Oh, the one that Shane just... okay.
No, it's removed.
But look, I guess I have a different sort of perspective. And yes, well, we all acknowledge that there's not enough houses, etc. But the housing first principles, or the Noongar housing first principles, is around is around culture and understanding culture, and it's how to work with Aboriginal people, you know, within homelessness and within the housing industry. So I think so it's about changing the mindset of those in the housing industry. You know, how to work with Aboriginal people. So it's not necessarily so much about whether there are houses available, but it's about changing the approaches. It's about making or engaging with Aboriginal people that is culturally safe, culturally appropriate, and so on. So I read that question more, and that's how I wanted to answer it from a cultural perspective, making those changes. Because if we don't do it now, when all the houses become available, then do we implement Noongar Housing First Principles? We've got to do it now. Because Aboriginal people are probably the most vulnerable and the highest numbers in terms of homelessness.
No worries.
Can I just very briefly mention, if you're narrowing down to culturally fit tenures, the cultural safety frameworks that developed both for Chiavik and Council to Homeless Persons in Victoria, which you can get online, have a bit of a go. And these things do vary across communities, in context, et cetera, but it's a bit of a starting point, I think, alongside Sandra's excellent principles.
And can I just say, like, you know, cultural safety frameworks, etc. Yep. But ours comes actually from the foundation of our Noongar Housing First Principles come from Noongar law, from our law. So what people call our practices, you know, our policies, our governance. But Noongar people say, no, this is our Noongar law. So what are the laws? And, you know, we say Buja, Mort, Kadajan, you know, it's Kwap Da, it's from Weirin, it's from the court and so on. So these are all of the laws that we as Noongar people need to work to. So it's not necessarily from a, you know, from a culturally safe framework, but it's from Noongar law. So whether it's Kuri law, you know, Murray law, Palawa law, that's how it should be looked at. So all of the different Aboriginal language groups could actually develop their own housing first principles. So it could be the, you know, the Kuri housing first principles, but it's written from their laws, from their cultural values framework.
No worries. Now, we're just about out of time, so...
Hello. Oh, hi everyone. My name's Gail Gray. I'm a proud Gumbaynggirr Wiradjuri woman working in Western Sydney, out at Blacktown. I think this question might be for you, Greg. I'm just really interested if in the Closing the Gap initiative, if there's any, I guess, initiatives targeting mob exiting our criminal justice system straight into homelessness. So I'm just really interested if there's, and I guess in the other states, you know, all the wonderful work that you guys are doing, if there are any sort of initiatives targeting mob, you know, with the overrepresentation of mob in our justice systems, juveniles as well, if there is anything targeting those areas with the new government as well, in the Closing the Gap initiative. Yeah.
Yes, there is, and we're just about out of time, but I'll have a chat to you after this session, if it's okay with you. It's just a reminder that the recording will be available for all delegates after the conference. You will receive further instructions about that later. And also, if you can complete the session survey, we'd really appreciate your feedback. And I'd just like to thank our esteemed speakers this morning. And thank you for those questions. Some of them we might work with the jury and see if we can answer them, take them on notice, and then get some response to people that did send in the questions. And just thank everybody for their time. I think we've covered everything very, very well in that in a holistic approach. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I think it sets a good platform for the rest of the today's events as well. So thanks everybody, and enjoy your morning tea. Thank you.